Oh, Nostalgia Critic, he who remembers it so I don't have to. Where have the years gone? Seems like just yesterday you first graced the low-resolution screens of early smartphones and MacBook computers, a classic of late 2000s YouTube, part of a great pantheon next to the likes of the angry video game nerd and also various strangers getting hit in the nuts. You inspired so many people to make videos in which they get angry at inconsequential media, laid the seeds for channel after channel to endlessly nitpick. Maybe it wasn't super original even then, but Nostalgia Critic provided a simple and appreciated framework fitting for the time. It wasn't complex, but as far as YouTube was concerned, people often didn't want that. Some might not even know that there was once a time YouTube wouldn't let you upload a video longer than 10 minutes. Due to both practical limitation and the predominant ethos of the time, internet videos were a lot like the lives of medieval peasants. Short, simple, and dirty. However, largely this isn't what people want anymore. As viewership increased and video creation became more practical and common, more people tried to make content and the expectations for everybody were raised. Of course, many of the predominant channels who you might lump in with a more modern definition of this part of YouTube have taken inspiration either directly or indirectly from the angry reviewer genre, of which Nostalgia Critic is a member, and more broadly the ideas that formed the popular series of the late 2000s. For better or worse, a lot of people have been influenced by Nostalgia Critic. Let's not forget how different the internet was at that time, when this was acceptable content. Less so nowadays. The landscape has changed, and even though Nostalgia Critic has been the target of ridicule for many years, the series keeps trucking on, in many ways completely unchanged over 13 years. If you're familiar with the more recent episodes, I'm sure I don't have to tell you that they're less influential. If people are taking inspiration from Nostalgia Critic's The Wall, it's not for the same reason anyway. But I'm not talking about Nostalgia Critic because it's some fundamental piece of media that needs to be discussed. In fact, it's kind of the opposite. Much of the influence even here that can be traced back to Nostalgia Critic could just as easily be attributed to Red Letter Media or AVGN, content that I would say by comparison holds up surprisingly well.
It fucking blows, it's a piece of shit, and I don't like it.
I'm talking about Nostalgia Critic because it's interesting, and because I want to. The lifeblood of old YouTube runs through the show, and through the repetition that's plagued this series for so long, you can find a lot of its DNA. It's symptomatic of a phase and a time and place of the internet, mirroring its desires, missteps, and ideas that through inspiration and path dependence have come to shape a part of internet culture.
Well, he remembers them so you don't have to. That's the nice thing about the Nostalgia Critic. He takes on that burden for you. He's a little bit like Jesus Christ.
Today, early Nostalgia Critic might seem rudimentary and amateurish, but standards used to be much lower, and just being able to intermix flat footage and B-roll with somewhat quick-paced comedic timing isn't a skill everybody had. It's fair to say that Nostalgia Critic is very watchable compared to its late 2000s contemporaries, couched in at least a simple understanding of video production. There are obstacles to considering the series worthwhile, however, including this. I'm glad we got over the whole loud screaming thing, mostly. The loud and angry approach Nostalgia Critic and others took was a thing for two reasons. Firstly, YouTube's previously mentioned time restrictions encouraged short-form and thus quickly paced videos, which lent itself to an obnoxiously high-energy style.
I think I might drown! And also I got a letter in the mail. It might be from my dad. To Fred.
Secondly, the predominant idea in regards to getting and maintaining viewership was, and in many ways still is, to immediately grab your viewers' attention and never let go. While there's clearly some efficacy to the ideas behind this method of video, time has shown that audiences attracted by the fast-moving, loud style usually aren't reliable viewership. Even massive subscriber counts crumble over time when attached to a style that does not lend itself to depth, and therefore investment. Moreover, it's patronizing. If content feels like it thinks you don't have the ability to maintain attention when something isn't screaming, it isn't respecting you intellectually.
General Top Chicken Nuggets!
Viewers pick up on this even subconsciously, and a number of people from early YouTube have since figured out that this isn't sustainable. And this doesn't just apply for screaming or violence. The way Doug performs the Nostalgia Critic is filled with the need to capture your attention, like he's worried you'll slip away if he's quiet for too long. He raises the pitch of his voice and adds near cartoonish emphasis to much of what he says. At times, it feels disrespectful to watch, especially when he delivers what could be considered the earnest criticisms of whatever film he's discussing. He curls around every word and speaks with such a fake, heartfelt cadence, it's easy to feel insulted.
From the music to the action to cutting out anything that's simply not needed, it gets right to what people want to see and keeps them there throughout the entire flick. I can hardly think of any other film that did that throughout the entire thing.
Nostalgia Critic is one of the most dramatic examples in early YouTube, but this oppressive emotionality has certainly not died out. And if you pay close attention, you can track the path dependence this idea bred to things such as the bizarre fellatio mimicry thumbnails that remain in popular use among vloggers and storytime YouTubers for some bewildering reason. The high energy performance works better for jokes, and Nostalgia Critic can be funny sometimes. And though it's easy to accept as a product of its time, it should be acknowledged that it has not changed at all in 13 years. There's credit to be awarded in earlier videos such as Battlefield Earth, where I'll admit I laughed on my rewatches, but many of the jokes as time has gone on have progressed from charming, albeit in a 2000s internet way, to depressing.
I'm officially starting a petition that Wesley Snipes never change.
And it's not just the jokes that have been totally immune to the passage of time either, it's essentially everything. In 2012, Nostalgia Critic ended to make way for another show on Channel Awesome, Demo Reel. But when Demo Reel proved to be a flop, the Walkers brought back Nostalgia Critic. For this reboot, actors from Demo Reel were brought along to act in various skits for Nostalgia Critic. I'll touch on this later, but for now just know that these skits are one of the only formula changes Nostalgia Critic has undergone over the years. Beyond that, from the blank wall behind Doug to the criticisms and presentation, the show has been totally static for the better part of 13 years. Doug and Rob found a style that brought reasonable success, and failing to find a substitute, have continually reused it for over a decade. The ethos behind the series, despite growing in resources and having an entire studio to work with now, have been stuck in the angry approach to video making that peaked in popularity long ago. In 2010, the gaudy green screen and goofy inter-video narratives were accepted by viewers, and were in many ways part of the charm, but compared to the offerings of today, they seem out of place. Rather than using this as a starting point from which to change and evolve, Nostalgia Critic has used more resources to make a larger version of the same thing week after week. It's also worth bringing up that simply because this type of video used to be song standard doesn't mean it was ever actually good. Given the comparatively small number of people making videos and the high barriers to entry, there was a certain novelty in this type of content. Now that that's been peeled away, the flaws that were inherent to begin with are harder to ignore, especially when they go unremedied despite years and years of production. As an aside, newer episodes of Nostalgia Critic will frequently leave shots for like 8 frames too long. Just enough time to be a little uncomfortable, revealing how Doug holds his exaggerated expressions for a weirdly long time in each take, and letting you imagine him solemnly getting up to stop the recording afterwards. This may seem small, but it got very distracting after a while. As the series continued, the approach to actual conversation about film crystallized into a progenic version of the play-by-play analysis that's so common with video essayists nowadays, in which media is discussed in chronological order, digressing into larger points when they become relevant. Nostalgia Critic does this in delivering a series of specific nitpicks as a way of developing easy comedy. You might recognize this from other Channel Awesome reviewer types, as well as more popularly CinemaSins and others, and in parts of YouTube this approach has maintained relevance. But in fact, Nostalgia Critic was one of the first to lean into it this hard. I was surprised to discover that this is what some people believe to be legitimate criticism. It's not. It's a style of comedy that relies on willfully misinterpreting media and relaying what are essentially fake concerns to the audience. It's comedy, but it's not criticism. Fiction relies on the suspension of disbelief to be enjoyed. Nothing you watch in a film or read in a book is real. It's a creation that resides in its own medium, and as a result, it's not perfect to life. Comparing it to reality and expecting it to conform will always result in inconsistencies. No media could possibly stand up to such an anal and misguided reading. This is to say that this technique can be applied to anything. It means nothing. While the nitpick style remains at most obnoxious when applied without the veneer of genuine commentary, it becomes brain-shatteringly stupid when applied to something under the guise of legitimate criticism.
Wait a minute, there are lost levels? Where on earth did they find these things? And how exactly did they become lost in the first place?
Take the famous plot hole regarding the Eagles in Lord of the Rings. In that example and many others, the inconsistency is not relevant to the point of the work, and while it can be fun to point out, it indicates nothing about the quality of writing. There are dumb creators who don't care or are incompetent and leave nonsensical holes in their story for bad reasons. But simply the presence of logical incongruities does not make a piece of media bad. Seeming contradictions and gaps in information are classic techniques in all storytelling mediums, and if used intelligently, only elevate the work. One consequence of realizing this is that often the inconsistency doesn't inform the opinion, but rather the opinion shapes the view of the inconsistency. When you read Brothers Karamazov and Dostoevsky never outright tells you who killed Fyodor, there's no greasy internet nerd yelling plot hole because any reasonable reader will infer that it's supposed to be somewhat ambiguous. And when you provide meaningful analysis of a work, you assume the creator has a reason for doing whatever it is that they're doing, that it's artistically valid. In order to apply nitpick criticism, you make the requisite assumption that the work is not artistically valid. I shouldn't have to tell you that's silly. Nitpick criticism doesn't demonstrate that something's bad, and while it's a poor habit for anybody claiming to deliver genuine discussion, there's nothing intrinsically wrong with using it on something you're not taking seriously. Nobody is claiming The Room or Riverdale have artistic credibility. Nitpick as you like. Just don't confuse funny gotchas with valid discussion and you're golden. This is the difference between YMS and Nostalgia Critic. It's no mistake that many more posts attacking Nostalgia Critic's thoughts on film cropped up after he started talking about less universally hated media using this technique. If it's written cleverly, the style can be fun, but it becomes trite and objectionable when the viewer doesn't go along with the innate assumptions of badness. And if you already like a film, chances are you won't accept the premise that it's bad before any argument has even been made. To be clear, Nostalgia Critic is a character, and one that knowingly embellishes actual opinions. The series is supposed to be humor and commentary, and the opinions of the critic are not one-to-one of those of the walkers. In fact, Nostalgia Critic frequently plays up non-existent or exaggerated issues seemingly to fill time when there's little to say about a film, which is symptomatic of the repetitious formula and unrelenting release schedule that Doug & Co. force upon themselves. Ooh. Oh boy. Ooh. An excellent example of how this type of criticism fails to capture the flaws in a work can be found in one of the early Nostalgia Critic reviews of the Baby's Kids game. There's a section where the critic is confused and frustrated that a rotating bookcase leads to 2 different rooms depending on what side of the bookcase you enter from.
If a bookcase opens up, it spins around in a circle. So that means that there can only be one room, because if there's a wall separating the 2 rooms, the bookcase wouldn't open!
His criticism amounts to the idea that it's not possible to construct a rotating bookcase that opens to 2 different rooms. The critic's frustration is valid, but his justification for considering this a poor design choice is not. Ignoring the fact that there likely is some method of sectioning off 2 pathways from one rotating bookcase, the physical and practical elements of this pathway are not the source of this flaw. The actual issue is that the player isn't given an indication that either side of the bookcase leads to a different room. If some sort of indication did exist, then the confusion would be eliminated. The critic completely misattributes the source of frustration on the part of the player to a material issue of logical consistency, when in fact it's an abstract issue of design and communication. This is exaggerated to some degree for purposes of comedy, but there's some earnestness behind it. And whatever motivations may exist, it suggests a flaw in Nostalgia Critic's dialogue about media. The series often focuses on issues such as logical consistency and character motivation to the exclusion of the countless other elements that go into a film, which many critics would consider significantly more important to its enjoyability. Casual and analytical viewers alike are usually willing to forgive loose plot or internal inconsistencies without reason if the film is well-paced, handles tension and payoff well, or any other number of elements more directly involved with the immediate experience of watching something. While the issues the critic skews towards are important in their own right, the framing of the series often reduces or completely ignores the rest of the film in their favor. It seems that some of the choices in regards to how the series is presented are either because Doug & Co. think more superficial observations about the film will attract larger audiences, or because they don't want to alienate their current audience with more complex discussion. Many of the people I've talked to, myself included, watched Nostalgia Critic when they were younger and lost interest as they aged. This, along with the insular comment section, language used, and the general lack of negativity within, suggests to me that the primary viewership might be on the younger side, and this would make sense. Nostalgia Critic is an incredibly accessible introduction to film discussion. It's energetic, easy to watch, and never gets too complex with genuine thoughts on media. For me at least, it was an easy way to first get acquainted with this side of the internet, and it seems to have been that way for others as well. Nostalgia Critic, before the heavy proliferation of awful skits, was a relatively easy watch, filling the role of being mildly entertaining without making you think too hard about anything in particular. The formula is designed from the ground up to be universally repeatable, with a rigid format for jokes intermixed with surface-level observations about film that, though they often miss the mark, aren't usually that offensive. I mentioned earlier that Nostalgia Critic embodies a progenic version of the play-by-play format of analysis, and a key part of that is summary. A bulk of any given Nostalgia Critic video is dedicated to explaining the plot of the episode's subject, in brief instances always punctuated by a joke or criticism.
Meanwhile, we discover that the villainous Mr. Freeze actually has a wife who has an incurable disease. So he keeps her frozen in the comfort and hidden safety of a neon-lit ice cream pub. How can nobody figure out that he's in there?
I encourage you to notice this in other series talking about media, because once you do, you realize exactly how prevalent it is. For many of these YouTubers, and especially for Nostalgia Critic, it serves as a backbone for every video. It's easy to see why, too. It provides a built-in guidepost to lean back on when you're not sure how to continue. And even without strong central ideas, it creates a narrative through line for your video. This can be provided, as many talented video essayists go about it, by a structured argument over time, which can be, and frequently is, mixed with summary by necessity of context in an essay. But simply explaining the plot of something has much of the same effect and is often more intuitive to write. Just sitting there having plot relayed to you is strangely enjoyable. It has a kind of placating effect. This is central to the success of channels like CinemaSins as well, which does something comparable by making trite, unfunny observations throughout a film, and in doing so tracing its plot. A substantial part of YouTube is various window dressings for the pacifying experience of having somebody explain a story to you, and I'd wager somebody could find a lot of success cutting out the middleman in that interaction. A great piece of evidence towards this being a central part of Nostalgia Critic's appeal is the decreased viewership on Doug's amateurish video essays designed to fill time between larger releases. These videos are completely devoid of summary by nature of being focused on a general idea or topic rather than being framed as a review. They're pretty horrible.
But the fact is, not every good film has a good trailer, and not every bad film has a bad trailer.
The fact that they do worse than normal episodes suggests that the summary experience is part of what leads people to watch the series, as this is the primary element missing when compared with normal episodes. Even when Doug and Rob began reviewing films that were still in theaters and thus had no usable footage in 2015, the format was kept rigid, and they decided that they'd rather do garish green screen reenactments than abandon summarization. They're aware that this is an essential element to the show's watchability. But the fact that this is even necessary for the series to function and remain popular should be a cause for concern. Why do we need to be distracted and railroaded away from developing opinions on the actual arguments when they're presented in order to accept the show? Shouldn't the comedy and thoughtful discussion hold up on its own? It appears that contrary to how the show is typically presented, the interest in watchability isn't actually based in clever writing or genuine discussion, but in watching a sinewy middle-aged man emote and flail wildly while explaining the story of various movies. This isn't necessarily a knock against Nostalgia Critic. Most of YouTube is not especially deep, and everybody wants something easy and mindless to watch sometimes. As the success of the platform itself has proven, there's demand for this style of content. But making something that's easy to get lost in doesn't mean that you can't provide intellectually worthwhile or artistically valid content at the same time. Plenty of channels do this with aplomb. Nostalgia Critic treats summarization as a device to render his videos watchable in spite of their genuine content, not in addition to it, effectively hiding his thoughts in a candy syrup to make the medicine slide down the throat a little easier.
This, I don't think this is a film light, but this is what was given to me.
Grabs hold of Diver 1, sucks him partially inside.
There is a tendency among YouTubers who grew to relevance in the early days of the platform to invest in higher production values that almost universally leads to diminishing or outright killing much of the charm that led them to popularity in the first place. My go-to example for this is Nostalgia Critic, but I can't cite him as an example in his own video, so less dramatically there's JonTron and Smosh. Though the limited charm of the latter was always on a cultural time limit, to put it kindly.
What are you gonna do now?
I'm going to Disneyland!
Oh boy, Disneyland, can I come?
No!
Intuitively, it's a sensible thought process. If your videos are good and making them appear more professional will make them better, then you should do it. The issue here is that it does not, in fact, make the content better. After adopting a more professional approach, JonTron lost a great deal of the strange energy that let his content stand out, and edged towards more traditional comedy as a result. While his content is frequently entertaining, it's different in a way that many longtime fans find off-putting. These changes, you should note in comparison to Nostalgia Critic, are not universally bad.
I hate it when my computer combusts because my own blood from my blood bag is spilling on my computer. Ah!
Channels have died long and pitiful deaths, latching onto a formula or style that once worked and holding on for years and years, only to find out that the concept was never dynamic or appealing enough to work for that long. And by then it's too late, and they've tied themselves to the mast of a ship that's taking on water. The way around this, besides just having sustainable format in the first place, is to change up your content. If you know you can't do what you're doing forever, you should evolve. That's the way these long-running shows actually manage to survive. Daily or weekly content is not optimal or even realistic for most content creators, and the forced march into routine and eventually uninspired content is a known and insidious killer. The difference between the evolution of a channel that's managed to stay sustainable among the tides of the internet, such as PewDiePie, who made the leap from loud Let's Plays to variety discussion, and the simpler changes of production quality in shows such as Nostalgia Critic and JonTron is key. PewDiePie is less restricted and has significantly more possibilities for what he wants to do, whereas Nostalgia Critic is changing his aesthetics and perhaps his ability to execute his own jokes closer to the form in his mind, but in essence the trajectory of the content remains totally unchanged. I've been talking in the abstract for this whole video, so here's something a little more real. Nostalgia Critic rents a studio in Illinois. He employs what seems to be several full-time staff. The monthly viewership of Channel Awesome has halved in the last 3 years. In 2018, the majority of Channel Awesome creators left following the release of a document detailing ineptitude, sexism, and abuse among the ownership of Channel Awesome, and to a lesser extent the Walker brothers. Nostalgia Critic is out of its era. The issue it's presented with as a result of the slow crawl towards faux professionalism is less the loss of charm and more what it reveals about the philosophy behind the show's progression, the desire to be real and respected, and to achieve that through becoming essentially a TV show. The creation of a formal studio with full-time staff makes this pretty clear. However, the fact is that the resources to achieve the look and feel that they're going for are not there. Even ignoring the unprofessionalism, organizational issues, and according to Lindsay Ellis, anti-intellectual streak present. And so Nostalgia Critic is stuck in a cheesy green screen hell, ever in pursuit of something it will never achieve as it grows old and gray and worse. The more misguided and ambitious the productions become, the further this is exposed. I can't help but speculate that the move towards these huge videos like Fury Road and The Wall is to some degree a rebellion against being locked in this frame of meaningless fake movie criticism, wanting it to turn into something, anything more. But the symmetry between this progression and many of Nostalgia Critic's contemporaries suggests that there's path dependence at play as well. A significant element is the fact that many of these early YouTube shows had little to base themselves on besides conventional entertainment, hence the prevalence of the terrible theme song introductions borrowed from television. This desire to imitate TV reveals another aspect, the dismissal of videos as a worthwhile medium. From the dawn of YouTube, it seemed like the goal of any mildly successful YouTuber was to somehow break into the mainstream, get a show on network television, star in movies, anything of the sort. Ray William Johnson, Annoying Orange, and Fred, with the latter two comprising some of the more embarrassing examples, come to mind. This is a path with heavily varying levels of success for obvious reasons. The results are typically awful and no doubt unsustainable for most creators. To be honest though, I can't blame these people for not having a ton of faith in videos as a medium, given that the vast majority uploaded are totally worthless. And even those that gain relevance are often insipid and uninspired. I'd be lying if I didn't say it feels silly to be treating a YouTube series as seriously as I am now. But the desperation with which so many of the early YouTube canon fled the site is off-putting. A necessity when making anything worth watching is believing that there's a chance it could be worth something. If you reject the medium you're using from the get-go and see it only as a poor imitation of something better, you've thrown out that possibility and any chance you had of making something that could stand the test of time. There's a sense of dissatisfaction inherent in trying so hard to escape your medium of choice. It's unwise creatively, and a frequent consequence for creators is imposing a self-made set of limitations imported from television that restrict what you're even willing to try, which is terrible in its own right, but less of an issue for Nostalgia Critic, as development and experimentation are not exactly its bread and butter. Boxing the series into an imitation of TV seems almost sad when you consider not only the above, but the fact that in 13 years the show has never been produced well enough to even get gainfully close to the aesthetic it pursues. Everything still looks tacky and low effort, the costumes are still awful, and the skit segments are still shot the exact same way the first Anniversary movie was shot a decade ago, complete with stilted, jumpy shot reverse shots so repetitive that it's a wonder they never tried anything different, at least by accident, in the last 10 years. Given that Doug and Rob have by necessity seen hundreds and hundreds of movies and shows over this period, it's shocking to me that they've never seen something that prompted any change in the production style of their own show. I won't speculate as to why this is, but I will remind you of Lindsay Ellis's comment on the Walkers' apparent anti-intellectual streak from earlier. In fact, given the framing as a review show and the earnest criticisms that appear in every episode, it's surprising to me how little consideration Nostalgia Critic ever gives the metatextual elements of film. Talk of things like cinematography and production choices are rare despite how essential they are to film. It's tough to tell whether these things are ignored because Doug and Rob assume their audience won't understand this type of discussion, or because they themselves don't pick up on these elements when watching movies, though the way they talk about movies out of character suggests the latter. But in either case, it's a strange move to ignore these essential elements of the films and shows they target. In the episode about Suicide Squad, he doesn't even mention the incredibly off-putting editing, despite it being one of the most glaring flaws in the film, choosing to focus instead on the far less important plot holes. If you pay close attention to the legitimate criticisms in each episode, those being the ones in which the critic pauses and stops telling jokes entirely for half a minute in order to give an overarching thought about an aspect of the movie, you'll notice that there's a tendency to focus primarily on the writing, pacing, and in-universe logic of whatever film. And while this is a perfectly valid lens to talk about film through, the lack of diversity and progression in the way these films are discussed starts to leave it feeling a little hollow after a few hundred episodes, especially when it's so simple and insular. As much as I've likely failed so far, I did genuinely want to avoid pointless dogpiling on aspects of Nostalgia Critic that have been well dissected. The series was a part of my childhood, but for that same reason, I believe it's important to give it a truthful level of scrutiny. My goal is not to embellish or attack, so please take me at my word when I say that the film discussion found in Nostalgia Critic is poor. His critiques are often somewhere between misguided and flat-out wrong, and while this is easier to ignore with his earlier videos, as they more frequently target movies that aren't really considered worthy of proper analysis, his points against more respected films are harder to forgive. Though it's been picked apart many times before, Nostalgia Critic's YouTube anti-classic The Wall makes this very clear. This is due in part to the criticisms being held within the limiting framework of parody lyrics, leaving little opportunity to obscure or dress them up. Throughout the video, he accuses the film of somehow being too obvious and metaphoric with its meaning, and simultaneously devoid of all meaning. A blatant contradiction that not even Doug and Rob can effectively distract the viewer from, despite how hard, and bizarrely hard, they try. This goes hand in hand with a tendency to avoid even the most cursory research.
Oh, Roger Waters, did you ever wonder why these images of slaughter made it in a film that also sings about how high school bites?
Which in this case would probably communicate to the Walkers that placing a song about war after Another Brick in the Wall Part 2 has a clear purpose, intended to contrast childhood with the loss of innocence Roger Waters experiences as a result of having his father die in World War II. They either failed to even Google the film that they were making a video about, or willfully ignored its essential elements in the interest of making joke criticisms that are neither jokes nor criticisms. There are too many obvious errors and nonsensical claims to reasonably group as one-off mistakes. This is a pattern. I talked before about the video essays that sometimes replace full episodes of Nostalgia Critic, and these are a great window into the unobscured thoughts of Doug in particular, since Rob doesn't co-write as he does in the full episodes. Most of these are triple the length that they deserve, apparently just for the purpose of shoving these horrific 3-minute sponsorship segments into the middle of each, but even ignoring this, the videos sound like they're written by a high schooler, just amateurish and awkward. Is the Joker could be imagining Batman a thought that justifies an 18-minute video? No. And the painful attempts to lengthen the script by running the same ground over and over prove this without doubt.
Every version of Batman can be canon if you accept it's all in his mind.
The points are so middle of the road that it feels like the only opinion Doug is comfortable sharing is one that either everybody already agrees with or is so inconspicuous that it's difficult to be upset by. I can't help but feel this is an effect of modeling the show after television to some degree, as if Doug believes the only way to maintain popularity is to repeat the opinions of the majority so as not to contradict or offend, leaving the critical content bland at best and mind-numbing at worst.
There are a lot of unfunny scenes and awkward moments, and yeah, it doesn't really need to exist. But I can also see how someone can enjoy it. The performers are great, there are some really funny jokes, and it can be really creative.
By contrast, the need to talk about popular films in the full episodes and provide criticism as the same formula dictates has more recently landed him in hot water. Filling the role of the critic in the mind of the walkers means finding something to criticize even if there's nothing, or what there is there to criticize is not so easily grasped in their simplistic style. The end result of this is contriving some form of negative thought, even when it's dumb and ends up being pointed out as such by the viewers. This makes sense if you're Doug and Rob, and your interest is in maintaining the character of critic and justifying yourself for talking about fucking Frozen 2 when your show is called The Nostalgia Critic. But knowingly or not, they are making their show bad and insufferable to watch. It doesn't help that as viewers rarely, if ever, give critical feedback. The backlash to videos like The Wall is typically the product of outside communities being exposed to the content that regular viewers of the show would consider par for the course, considering that equally egregious videos have generally flown under the radar. Even the Joker essay from earlier is sitting pretty at a 95% like ratio, with the comment section totally unfazed by its content. Fans of the show care very little about the discussion present in the video, with comments primarily focusing on the more aesthetic elements and jokes. The conception of the editorials suggests some fundamental misunderstanding of the motivations people have for watching these, though it's difficult to blame the walkers for this entirely when most viewers are unable to accurately verbalize what they find appealing about a video. The analysis littered throughout standard episodes of the show are not why it's popular, so it seems like a bizarre move to have entire episodes dedicated to it. It's entirely possible that the walkers do not understand that the appeal of their show comes from pacification and not from enlightening the audience and encouraging them to think about a film differently. After all, when you spent more than a decade making a show like this, an acknowledgement like that is difficult to make, and even more difficult to internalize.
Cat scream, that just means I'm gonna make some sort of cat noise.
The best approximation for the experience of watching 700 episodes of Nostalgia Critic is that scene at the end of 2001: A Space Odyssey where Bowman finds himself in a room where he watches himself become an old man and die, except that old man is Doug Walker. Still just as creepy though. How many times can one person watch the same thing? Time passes, the world changes, everything is different. Everything but Nostalgia Critic. Of course, there are aesthetic differences, actors change, there's more skits, a new theme song, but none of that stuff really matters. At the core of the show, there's an unnervingly static philosophy that penetrates every aspect, every decision, and every movement. It sheds the skin, but what's underneath remains the same. I feel like I'm being trapped, deep inside an underground bunker, with nothing but shadows dancing across the wall in front of me. The figures and shapes change little by little each day, but every night they put on the same show. The lines, the motions, the rise and fall, and the heroic ending. After a while, I realized the thing that I'm watching was never a story. It's just the movements of the sun painting the same shapes it's painted since time immemorial. Old Nostalgia Critic isn't something you can fairly call bad, much in the way you can't really call pre-Renaissance art bad. It's not poorly executed so much as it's out of its era. It's cheesy and fundamentally low concept in the way that anything else from 2007 would have been. But while the other figures from that time retired or changed, Nostalgia Critic keeps going in the same direction, and it will until viewership diminishes enough that the ground crumbles from underneath, as we've seen happen to so many others. I don't think this is a bad thing. Nostalgia Critic has been far more resilient than most, still keeping up respectable view counts despite a downward trend. This is impressive, since as much as I've talked about the virtues of change and evolution, it's far too easy to get lazy and adjust your content for the worse when you're convinced that you're too big to fail. The source of this feat, however, is a refusal to change so strong that it suffocates much of what could have remained in a show with such longevity. Breaking down singular examples is usually an essential technique in media discussion, but over the course of making this video, I've discovered that it doesn't work very well when discussing Nostalgia Critic, for the very simple reason that many of the elements present in it are totally universal. Citing a single episode is the equivalent of citing a single blade of grass on a green that stretches on for miles. It feels banal when faced with an overwhelming tide of decision after decision made in perfect homogeny with no plan or desire to vary at all. It makes much more sense to talk about these concepts in sum, because if I tried to lay out the similarities over time, it would be endless. I've been forced into talking in the abstract for the entire video on this basis. Listen, I watched a heinous number of Nostalgia Critic videos to write this. I resent few things in my life more than the time wasted watching any Nostalgia Critic video released after the year 2012. Each episode blends together into this sickly malaise after a while. How many times can you listen to one man make the same joke, the same observation, the same introduction? I don't know, but it's less than this. There's something unnatural about the critic's refusal to change even the most minute element of his formula. People have made livings throughout time doing things much more repetitive than this, but the purpose of getting into a creative line of work is to avoid precisely this soul-shredding repetition. It's because you can't or you won't do the same thing every day until you die. So to choose another path and then turn around and do that anyway is tragic. The rigidness with which the status quo is maintained has led the show from quirky and standard in the late 2000s to old and vaguely sad today. But an effect of that is preserving the ethos of 2000s YouTube, serving as an intermediary between the older home video era of the site and the more produced standards of today. What it teaches is exactly why those ideas from the time needed to change. Locking yourself into a static format and trying in vain to imitate TV was never going to work, and the look and feel resulting from those ideas has grown stale compared to modern competition. Modern creators avoid the aesthetic downfalls of early YouTube shows like Nostalgia Critic by orienting themselves to a more distinct type of production that eschews imitating TV entirely, usually setting on a more casual, jumpy style, which I would suggest in most cases is the right move. The beauty of YouTube, after all, is that you can do whatever you want. You're not held back by the expectations of your producers or money on the line. You can make something different that you want to make, without worrying whether or not it falls into established standards. And I'm not sure the Walkers want to make what they're making. Nobody can earnestly say that they want to do the same thing every day, every week, forever. I can't help but think of that wall behind the critic, changing shades over the years but ultimately sitting there naked, undecorated every episode. No doubt it was the product of an initial idea to create a video, a spark to emulate and explore that was hastily executed, with nothing on hand for a set but a cheap folding table and a plain wall. I'm sure most anybody can relate to the creative impulses behind it, and it's nothing if not symbolic of the huge, out-of-reach dreams behind so many channels, especially in the earlier days of YouTube. Which is why it feels so strange to see it perverted into an agent of uninspired repetition, never re-examined or criticized by its creator. Despite the mockery that's so common around the series today, Nostalgia Critic is difficult to dismiss as just another mediocre channel. There's too much of a past behind it. Those who are so invested in making fun of it have almost certainly watched and enjoyed the show at some point before, with only age on the parts of it and them to reveal the misguided elements that can no longer be ignored. It's clear that Nostalgia Critic will remain popular for some time. The viewers who watch every week, year after year, likely aren't interested in exhaustively exploring the nature of the show, so much as they want the comfort and reliability of sitting down to a cheater's watch of a new movie with familiar comedy every week, not worrying about the artistic credibility of an ancient YouTube series. Through this, it's impossible to deny that there's a seed in Nostalgia Critic, an explanation for the series' longevity and popularity, and I believe it to be that, the routine. I doubt that many of the people still watching the series are sincerely convinced that it's providing thoughtful commentary. They want the same thing that they had last time, and in that way, Nostalgia Critic has succeeded.